What I'm hearing from you is that corporations will have a very important role in kind of shaping the future, and it sounds like you guys think they got to have a very positive role. But can you think of some examples of how companies could have a negative role in influencing the future? And do you have any ideas about how we could change that?
Well, sure. I mean, if you look at what happened with Facebook and Twitter, in recent years, where algorithms were clearly designed to maximize a certain type of behavior. That behavior was not well regulated by the companies, and you end up essentially with a kind of menu for terrorism and a menu for mass murder on these sites, where people are literally being inspired by and sharing information with the purpose of creating harm. And I think those companies were extremely slow to realize that and realize that they had the tools to change it. And I think that suggests an entire area of artificial intelligence and big data that can be used for harm. So that's certainly a place where I think a lot of thinking needs to take place in government, among corporations, and in civil institutions.
And actually, we talked about artificial intelligence actually going back now 20 years or so. There was a market for energy trading of electricity that Enron basically played out and made a lot of money doing it using some algorithms. Now imagine what they could do now if they existed in being able to defraud those markets, right? The artificial intelligence, the training algorithms would actually bring out the maximum profit algorithm, if you will, and it's probably what Enron did. But we, at that point, said we should not be able to do that. No company should have that kind of power to regulate or to set the price of electricity in such a way that it essentially gouges consumers. So that's also going back to the earlier question, the role of government to, again, set the ground rules, what is acceptable and what's not acceptable. And for these governments also to be the interlocutor, or what's the right word, perhaps the aggregators of information, of thought from a society of what we believe is right or not. I think that's very important. So that's one classic example. But I also want to kind of focus on a little bit more on the positive side, and using that same example of electricity trading markets. We talk about corporations. There's other types of corporations and NGOs, and I'll speak about MIT, for example, is a not-for-profit corporation. And so, but we have a different mission being not-for-profit. And part of our contribution to the world and part of our mission is to be as transparent as possible as how we're operating. And the reason we do that is because it's very difficult to figure out how to make these sustainable decisions around growth, for example. You have to look at what the incentives are for managers, what the mission is for the organization, what the results are expected from the stakeholders for-profit corporations as shareholders. When we built a new building, it required a lot more energy, and we had to build a second cogeneration plant. And we're burning a lot of natural gas. But we said, we're going to be carbon neutral by 2030. How is burning a lot more natural gas going to get us there? And it wasn't. And so we had to look at what are the alternative mechanisms that allow us to grow at the same time, reduce our carbon footprint. And through some financial engineering and some very creative use of our purchasing power along with other companies, we were able to guarantee purchasing from a solar farm actually in South Carolina that took off the grid a coal burning power plant. But it wasn't in New England. And with financial engineering, we were able to use the revenue from that investment to actually then pay for greener energy at MIT in New England, right? But it required the trading mechanism of electricity, the market. It required some financial engineering, some technology, and a management focus and leadership to say, we're going to grow, but we need to do it in a carbon neutral way. And so similar to what you were talking about earlier, what everybody knew they had to do 40 years ago to do quality costs more. Now assume, like many companies, everything you do has to be carbon neutral. What kind of decisions do you undertake? And in the end, for us, actually, it didn't cost us any extra. And we might make maybe $1 million per year. And so that's interesting.
I think today people understand that companies have a huge role to play in shaping the future, particularly in the areas of emerging technologies. And we used to look to government to actually regulate and ensure that these companies and their corporate interests were aligned with some kind of common good. Now today, confidence in government is at its all-time lowest in many parts of the world. So today, who are global citizens to look to hold these corporations accountable, particularly in the areas of ethics? Any thoughts?
Well, there's definitely a vacuum. I mean, there's no question about that. And I think part of the answer has to be what can government do to restore its trust? And that's a big ask, not just in the United States, but across the globe. I think there are, especially in certain sectors, roles to be played by third parties like nonprofits, like universities, to some extent the media. I think that the sort of consumer jury has a role to play about whether certain types of activity are ethical or not, and that can when it's channeled properly have a real impact. But I do think we don't want government to shrink to zero because, as Jose was saying earlier, there are certain problems that can't be tackled only at the level of government, but rather at the level of the state.
And I would add that there's also going to your point, Jim, about third parties. In certain industries, there's associations of people that are working in the industry that realize that there's some ethical issues that they need to tackle right up front before the technologies are even implemented. And so we've seen that in synthetic biology, we've seen that certainly now in artificial intelligence, but it's been an extension of the work that scientists and engineers started doing right after World War II with the atomic bomb. So it's this kind of self-organizing, at the same time self-informed association that needs to play a big part in understanding what are the ethical dilemmas that are going to come up, and to start the conversations with societies and communities, and then try to figure out how to then inform the deployment of these technologies.
So I come in from a little bit different spot because I am an emerging technology company and I work in emerging markets, so I do work with governments. Now, we do come from a place of a common good, at least for my organization, what we're trying to do from a social good perspective. But you can see in some jurisdictions, government's very weak. And I'm not a large multinational, but a large multinational can easily come into some of these jurisdictions and do whatever they want. So there needs to be some trust factor. There needs to be some of the global code of ethics that we're talking about here, and hopefully Humanity 2.0 will obviously be a part of that on a global scale as it grows and so forth. But there's definitely a giant vacuum, especially not in the U.S., but in the emerging markets specifically, because they want businesses to come in. They want job creation, right? They want to do what's best for their constituents. But sometimes you're gonna have the wrong players come in there, especially if it's a resource-rich country as well. I mean, there's countless stories of horrific things happening on the continent about that, but there's still such that vacuum. But it comes down to me for what Jose mentioned earlier about the leadership of that organization, right? The morality of that management team and what their belief system is.
Do you think in the boardroom itself, when a company's about to release a new piece of technology they recognize may have huge implications on society, that there is this conversation going on? Is this technology going to be good for humanity, or may it actually be a net negative, but it may make us a lot of money? Is this something they struggle with?
Not enough.
No, I don't think so.
I think certainly, to Matt's point, I think smaller companies, when they're starting off, the whole point is you're going to go change the world in a positive way, right? And so they're having these conversations, and then as they're thinking about how do we deploy to the marketplace, is what's the best way to do it in a positive way. I think once an organization starts getting bigger and bigger, especially as they become public corporations that then have to answer from a fiduciary point of view to shareholders, there's kind of that, I don't want to call it a gray area, perhaps a little bit of pressure of saying, well, this is a good option and this is an almost good option or not as good an option. Which way do I go when deploying this technology? But I completely agree, it's not enough yet. And to your point as well is I think organizations like Humanity 2.0 and others have to help us in the boardroom to figure out these kind of conversations, saying how to well, how to facilitate these conversations. I think that's the other big part, having catalyst.
Right, so companies like Volkswagen, right, one of the biggest auto manufacturers in the world, it basically falls apart because of an ethical breach. What do you think could have prevented something like that happening? What's the single most important thing that Volkswagen didn't have that led to that company failing?
Integrity. I mean, I don't think there's any substitute for it. I think that if you get companies collaborating on issues like that, that opens up door for all sorts of problematic behavior. Obviously, the regulations were in place. I think the regulations were sufficient. But if a company chooses to lie to its regulators, to its shareholders, to its customers, I don't know that there's a lot that anyone can really do about that except try to weed out the bad actors as soon as possible. I don't mean that to be a pessimistic answer. I just think it's a realistic one.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because when you have the same thing, the management kind of leadership piece that's lying to their shareholders, and again, completely lack of trust and transparency then at that point, with the real data that should have been deployed. That's a big hurdle to overcome, both inside the organization. I'm sure that was just shocking throughout the entire organization. I'm sure there were people that worked there for years and years and years, and it was part of their fiber as a human that I worked for Volkswagen, this is my company, and just demoralized them as well.
One of the things that I hear a lot is the single most important ingredient to ensure that the companies have a net positive for humanity, not a net negative, is transparency. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, that's probably the most important.
Yeah, I would. In addition to transparency, which is perhaps a little bit different way of saying what Matt just said, it's also from the cultural perspective, having a system that allows people that have some kind of doubt to voice that doubt in a way that is visible and not threatening. And that's part of the culture. So transparency is part of the culture as well, for sure.